Hey everyone, this is a clip from a recent episode of the Men of Steel podcast where we talk about Superman and Superman adjacent topics. If you enjoy this clip, check out the podcast. You can find it at certainpov.com or wherever you get your shows. So I am joined here with the esteemed Paul Kupperberg, writer of Reflected Glory and also just a legend in the space of comic book writing. Paul, thank you for coming on the show.
My pleasure. I don't get asked to talk about my prose often, so this is good. I like that.
As listeners joining us here will know from the beginning of the episode, the story Reflected Glory has always been one of my really favorite prose works about superhero fiction.
Oh, thank you.
The book Superheroes was, in like the mythology of Case Aiken comic book fandom, finding this book was a big part of me branching out beyond just like, oh, I like comic books because they are fun images and cool stories, and really sort of exploring from a deconstructionist lens a lot of the things you can do with superhero formatting.
Right.
And it was really exciting because Reflected Glory was a story that I had been told about independently. And then I came across this book when I was about 2 pages in. I was like, oh, it's that story. So questions for you to start. Just give a little background about how you got into comics and specifically superhero fiction. And then where does that take you in terms of like getting into writing this entry in the anthology?
Well, I've been a comic book reader and fan my entire life. I literally don't remember a time in my life when comic books weren't around. You know, that was always there. I read them all through the 60s. I made friends with some other kids who were also comic book fans, and we started doing fanzines in the early 70s. That led to both of us getting into comics. Paul Levitz, who I think he was working in the mailroom at DC for a while. I don't remember the details. But no, Paul, went on to become executive editor and publisher and president of the company. And I never had a head for business, so I became a writer and worked in editorial. So, comics are in my blood. They have been just something I've been doing my entire life.
It's so exciting to see people who have these passions and actually being able to follow through and make a living out of it.
But the prose stuff, 1966, I think it was Captain America and the Great Gold Steel by Ted White, which was a Captain America novel that came out. Marvel was still relatively new, and they published 2 novels. One was The Avengers versus the Earthwrecker, written by Otto Binder, which is a terrible book. The other was Ted White's The Great Captain America and the Great Gold Steel, which is a really good book. I had been reading comics, actually reading comics for 4 or 5 years at that point when I read these things. And it was like, this is bigger than comic books. This is bigger than the Batman TV show. This is the first time you ever get into the heads of the characters. Not just thought balloons, which are, but when you have that omniscient narrator, that third person narration going on, it's just like, that's what's going on in their heads. Not just, I can't explain it, but it just brought these characters to life. The next best example of that kind of thing was in the late 70s when there was the Marvel novel series. Pocket books published. There were supposed to be 12, but they only did 11.
No, they did 11.
The 12th one was Silver Surfer, and at the last minute it was deemed that only Stan was allowed to write the Silver Surfer. So this William Rotsler written Surfer novel was scrapped. I wrote 2 of them. I wrote a Spider-Man novel and a Spider-Man and Hulk novel for that series. Len Wein and Marv Wolfman were editing and packaging it. They also did 1 book of short stories, the Marvel Superheroes, and one of them was a Daredevil short story written by Martin Pascoe under the pseudonym Kyle Christopher. It was the first time I ever really got a sense. Daredevil was never a character I particularly cared for. I didn't much care for Gene Colan as an artist, and the character was just kind of eh. But Marty got inside this guy's head. And, he can't see, so his radar sense and his other senses interpret everything around him. Marty showed that. Marty had that thinking in the story. He kind of used all these adjectives, these weird adjectives to describe, the way things like felt instead of what they looked like, because he was seeing an image of it. But it's so detailed that it was almost better than sight. Marty was a great writer, but that was just kind of a holy crap. You can do things with superhero prose, which in my 2 novels, I hadn't gotten anywhere close to.
We've talked about the shift in media for different properties. Obviously right now we're in this like age of like movies that are really showing off how things can move in interesting ways, like the opening of Captain America Winter Soldier made Captain America feel vibrant and like
Mhm.
active in a way that is difficult to convey on the page. And we talked a lot about the Superman radio show on here, which just by virtue of like, well, we have to describe things, we have to have narrators, we have to like vocalize everything, it changes the types of actions and changes the types of stories you're going to tell just by virtue of that all. And it's
Sure.
it's really exciting to see how you can have all these different types of ways of telling a story that, I mean, for a sizable percentage of my life was viewed as strictly bound to this one particular format.
Yeah. And now we rule the world.
Yeah. But really, like we can highlight that these types of stories aren't bound to any one of these. It's just that the certain types of those stories work better in each of those formats, and characters can click for you in ways that are very different. So, seeing the potential of prose for that type of story, what were then the steps that led to doing the story Reflected Glory and having that be in the anthology Superheroes? Was the story something kind of floating around for you for a while? Was it a bunch of ideas? Were you approached about the book or heard about the book, and then started working on an idea for it? Like, where did that start?
It was edited by John Varley and Risha Meinhard. Risha was also a literary agent, and she was Julie Schwartz's agent. He was the editor at DC Comics, of course. And I had written a lot for Julie over the years, but this was after he had stopped active editing and was more consulting than anything else. But he was up at DC, I was up at DC, Risha was up at DC, and we met in the hall and we're talking. And Julie says to her, "You ought to get him to write a story for that anthology you're doing with Varley." And Risha said, "Oh, okay. You want to write a short story for the anthology I'm editing with John Varley?" And I said, "Oh, absolutely." I had written 2 Spider-Man novels, to be fair. Novels and short stories are also very different things. In my entire life, although I had, fooled around scribbling as a teenager, I wrote a lot of stories. I didn't finish very many of them, and the ones that I did were not very good. I had never really written this is for a real book. I mean, it was the publisher. This was Ace Books. This is big time publishing. But yes, it's like an actor. Can you ride a horse? Of course I can ride a horse. Then you go and learn to ride a horse. Same thing when I got approached to write a screenplay. Can you write a screenplay? Of course I can. Once I learn how.
Yeah.
So I just took the gig, and then it's like, oh crap, now I need a story. Fortunately, I had before me the real life example of the public relations agent in the story.
Jack Weiser?
Jack
Yeah.
Weiser, yes. Jack Weiser is entirely based on a real person, a colleague and former friend.
Question: was the former at the time former, or former now as of now former?
It was in the process of becoming former.
Okay.
The colleague part made things problematic. I had to maintain certain cordial relationships just because we were working together. But the fuck off, I don't want to see you again part still lay in the future. But it suddenly occurred to me that this guy, he can best be summed up by a story from years later. A bunch of us were walking through Manhattan, the streets of Manhattan, to Grand Central Station one night. And this guy said words which most people who know him have come to dread. "Have I ever told you the story ... And one of the other guys piped up without hesitation and went, "Oh, is this the one where you're the hero?" That sums this guy up. Everything is about him. He is the guy who has to have the idea, who has to have the credit, whether he had the idea or not, and was more about form than substance. So, I had this guy to work with. He actually had a public relations background, so that even made it more convenient. And I kind of built a story from that. It's like, I know what he's done with comic book superheroes, but what would he do with a real superhero? And I kind of like, well, he'd make it about him. He'd build it into something for him. He'd rationalize like crazy, as Jack does in the story. No, I'm just the steward of all this stuff. I don't tell. It's okay with Ultimate. It should be okay with you, But again, it was all there. Kind of the guy was just there. And then, to be fair, there's a healthy dose of stealing from The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, the punchline to that. when the legend becomes bigger than the truth, print the legend. So, that was what this guy decided to do. He would rather have the legend that he could control than the reality that was out of his hands.
Yeah, like the strength of a martyr kind of situation.
Yeah. Through Ultima, I was also a little bit able to, I had written a lot of Superman during the 80s, just before the crisis. I was one of the main writers on, all the Superman books, and I was doing Supergirl and Superboy and the Superman newspaper strip. So I had plenty of experience with the character, and I never went very deep with him because by then the editor, Julie, was kind of approaching the end of 40 plus years on the job. And I think he was Supermaned out. And frankly, I don't think I was writer enough at the time to do it. I don't really think I had much to say about the character. So it kind of allowed me to go back and think about that stuff and kind of look at it from the hero's point of view. Before I started writing Superboy, young Clark was always the victim. Being Superboy victimized him. He couldn't be a normal kid because he had this secret he had to keep. And even as a young reader, I was like, well, just because you can hit a baseball doesn't mean they're going to assume you're Superboy. All the other kids can hit a baseball. Nobody thinks they're Superboy. But that was the bit. That was the shtick. He has to be meek and mild.
Yeah.
And it was like, well, he's the victim here. And, I can't have a girlfriend because she might discover I'm Superboy. So when I was writing the book, I finally got Julie to let me drop that stuff, to let Clark pick up a baseball bat and play with the rest of the kids. And everybody goes, oh, hey, that wasn't bad, Clark. Good. Okay, And that was it. Nobody jumped up and said, you're Superboy. I gave him a girlfriend and tried to integrate him into the real world because why was he being the victim? But I guess when you look at it from the point of view of this guy, of Ultima, he made himself the victim. He didn't have to do what he did.
Yeah, there's actually like a specific passage that I can picture how your thought process was going on that, where when he's describing being in college and like walking a girl home, that's the moment where he realized that no one was out there to get him. Like no one was like looking for him.
Yeah.
And then realizing that that's now completely changed because he has gone into like a public light. When you're working on Superboy, it's before we get to this idea of Clark hid his powers through his whole life, like the stuff that would be introduced post-crisis, which has sort of become now the norm. Even when they play into the idea that he was doing stuff with his powers, it's still, he's a man of mystery. What was that blur, like on Smallville or things like that? And you can see how like the ideas you're tackling are the ones that are starting to emerge in the zeitgeist of like, well, he's not automatically going to be known as this like being of superpowers and whatever. The original thoughts of Superboy being this like puckish version of Superman that they could tell like less morally upright stories back in like the late 40s, early 50s had totally shifted.
There are also kids stories. There are also stories about other kids getting in trouble or into mischief, those very first ones. So yeah, it wasn't meant to be this complicated thing. It was just like, frankly, cheap exploitation, which brings us back to the story.
So in terms of creating the story, it's mostly told from the perspective of Jack, but then we do get these interview segments with Ultima that are explicitly off the record ones that he's keeping. And that sort of the twist at the end is that these are recordings that Jack can use to clear his name when things go wrong. How did you settle on that structure?
Well, we had to hear from Ultima. Jack's an unreliable narrator, so we needed something from the horse's mouth. I figured the interviews for the biography he was supposed to be working on would be the way to get to that. And, this is a guy who has no one to talk to. So when he does start talking, he's going to start saying things like, yeah, don't put that in the book, because he's got to say it. It's got to come out.
Like Jack is such an interesting viewpoint for this character. And like the name Reflected Glory coming from that sort of central point of it. But the subtitle, the difference between a hero and villain is spin, I believe.
That was their line. The editors put that line in, but yeah.
That's such a fun take on the character because you highlight very well that this would be terrifying and that these things could go wrong so easily. Talk a little bit about that because like this is one of my examples of like a deconstruction of a Superman type where there are consequences to his actions.
Well, there has to be. I mean, it's always a joke bit. I just watched the first episode of that new Superman animated thing, and they do it again where Clark opens a door and inadvertently rips the handle off the door. And you're like, oh, that's funny. It's a door handle. It's like, it could also be somebody's hand.
Right.
I mean, if he can't control it, if he's not thinking and doesn't control it there, why are we to assume he's always going to be able to control it when it really matters? So that's kind of addressed. All the stuff we joked about in the 70s, the Larry Niven's Man of Steel, Woman of Kleenex, and those types of things. The next generation or the generation after that, writers came in and gone, what about that? In a lot of ways, those are things best left unasked in superhero comic books, because superhero comic books, they're not meant to be deconstructed, because they fall apart very easily because, people can't fly and beams don't shoot out of their eyes. And I'm always amused at what people choose to reality test in these stories. How can they recognize him with just a pair of glasses and, and a spit curl, and they don't know that Clark Kent is Superman? So that's where you draw the line. That's where your reality is tested, not the fact that he freaking flies and comes from another planet. So this stuff is very fragile. There was, speaking of Martin Pascoe, there was a story he did at Julie's insistence, and Marty would have insisted on telling you that if he heard me telling you this story, where they explained why nobody recognizes him, that he emits some kind of super hypnosis unconsciously that are magnified by the Kryptonian glass lenses in his glasses. It goes out over TV waves, and it makes people see Clark as kind of, a little bit more frail and stooped and all that. And it was like, okay, well, I suppose in this world, that's a good answer to a question that never should have been asked. You've accepted it for the last 40 plus years. Why is it now a problem? Well, because the fans are asking, how does this work? Why does this work? And you know what? You're too old to be asking these questions. If you were younger and reading these things, you wouldn't think to ask them because your suspension of disbelief would be complete. Once you start questioning this stuff, it's got to fall apart. I mean, a one-off story, you can take these tropes and deconstruct them, and it's one thing. To make that the continuing arc of comic books kind of brought us to where we are, which is we have to change everything once a year because...
Yeah, there was a long time of a status quo that you could sort of work with. And this book in general, most of the stories in it are saying, here's the status quo, here's the one change we're making, and how it kind of goes from there. Another story I really like in it is the One of the Boys story, where it's just well, if Superman's an alien, would he see things our way? Even if we see him as a human, would he see us like him? How would that kind of go?
Right.
And I enjoy those sort of takes of where resting on this shared cultural knowledge of the genre, of the medium, of everything, and how we can change the one thing and see how the story, like you said, it kind of falls apart very quickly once you make those changes.
But that's the nature of fiction. I mean, that's what a story is. You take the status quo and Jack Reacher comes to town and everything explodes. That's just storytelling. It's the story you're telling and the premise that you're setting up. My feeling is, buy the premise, buy the bit. If you accept that Clark Kent is Superman, shut up, get on with the story. You don't have to worry about the why and the what. Comic books spend so many decades, 2 or 3 decades, focusing on that whole Clark, Lois, Superman triangle, with her always trying to find out his secret identity and trying to get Superman to marry her and all those ridiculous Weisinger-era stories that kind of became set into the character. Even today, there's still kind of those elements of it. They still occasionally will do, say Clark, no, it couldn't be.
I think there's a certain amount of buy-in when we're talking about these kind of formats, because it's such... Are we accepting that there's the flying character? Are we accepting that the secret identity works that way? Are we accepting all these elements to allow the story to move forward? Mm-hmm. And if you aren't accepting of part of that, then how does it all kind of click? It kind of makes me think of this joke about vampire fiction, which is that every time someone writes a new vampire story, the first thing they have to do is explain how their vampire is like the vampires from the movies and from lore, and how they're different. And everything that's different is oh, that's just from the movies. We don't care about garlic, or
right.
Or whatever thing they decide is
we don't care about whatever's inconvenient for my story.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And it's not that and they'll argue well, this makes sense, but this part doesn't. But honestly, none of it makes sense. So why, where is your cutoff on the bullshit side?
Well, there's also no international council of rules for vampire fiction or for superhero fiction. Everybody is free to make up their own stuff, which is fine and dandy. Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, I was in, It would be nice if you could watch a thing and go, but that doesn't, okay, that's just for this movie. if you kind of knew the rules going in, but figure it out. I guess there's a learning curve in any new thing you're watching.
On that note, I want to talk a little bit about Ultima specifically. Obviously, the character is a Superman type character. He flies invulnerable, super strength, and is in the same way as like the Golden Age take on the character, showing up and kind of just throwing cars around, and this very active, aggressive kind of like symbol of justice that's in there. A little bit of a bully. I would imagine that since the point is to do a story about a publicist and his reaction to a real superhero, well, Superman's the first traditional superhero from that perspective, so like you were taking it from there. How did you sort of decide on like, well, what was Ultima's deal? I mean, like, he has a very specific power set, he has very specific weakness, all these details. Where did you decide what things to put in versus what things to cut from like the broader superhero lore that you could pull from?
Well, it was a short story. It's overstuffed as is. I think the first draft was like close to 13,000 words. I don't know what it's printed at, but it was already running long. So there's only so much you can do. And I don't need super breadth. Once you start throwing fancy powers in there, you sort of have to explain them. One thing I did learn from Julie Schwartz, which is true, you never have a character walk into the room and you don't introduce them by name. And that also includes things like, Superman 2, and he rips that cellophane S off his costume and goes throwing it across the room. And everybody's like, what the hell is going on here? When you introduce something like that, you need to explain it. So rather than come up with something that I'd have to spend time explaining, I just kept it simple. Everybody understands flying, strength, and invulnerability. I don't think I used any other powers.
You mentioned that he's smarter and faster.
Oh, yeah, well,
that's all
the
same kind of...
Yeah.
Now, you specifically went with psychic powers for it. And I feel like that was kind of in the zeitgeist at that point when this was being written.
It wasn't so much that as it was, I needed a back door. Specifically, his powers are psychic, and that he has to be focused and on guard for them to be active was my back door. That's how Jack's able to, catch him in a moment of unawares and do what he does. You're writing the story and you get to a certain point and you go, oh, that's how I'm going to do it. And then you go back and you put that thing in.
Okay, so you started with like, he's got superpowers. What is his weakness? And then you work back to how his powers worked so that weakness worked. Okay.
Right.
That's very cool. Yeah, because it seemed like mid-'80s up through the 90s, there were a lot of characters who had Superman type powers that they tried to use like psychic power justifications.
That was Byrne's thing. That's what he did in Man of Steel. It's like Superman's powers are largely psychic. That's how he can lift an airplane without it snapping in half.
Or like Gladiator, who actually kind of shares a similar kind of weakness in that if he's not confident, he is lacking the power. And then the flip side of it, we're recording this in 2023. We recently had the anniversary of the death and return of Superman. And one thing we identified when we were really talking about it was that it was interesting that Superboy, the Con-El Superboy, like the 90s Superboy, who has psychic powers, it's interesting there because he's almost the reverse of the Ultima situation, where the psychic powers allows him to be more slapdash and more shoddy with how he does his stuff without hurting people. Like, he'll pick people up and like flip them around and so forth. And it's because he's psychically holding them. When he like picks up Jimmy Olsen and is holding him upside down, Jimmy's not hurt by it because he's actually being telekinetically lifted. So it's interesting where like that's a scenario where like a very similar concept of powers is being used to be like, here's a kid-friendly, safer version of it, like to justify, well, no one ever got hurt in the stories. And that's because, X, Y, and Z reasons of powers. And then this one is doing the same basic power set, but then really exploring what the consequences of it would be if it was just focused on you.
And if there's no gauge on those powers, if it's on or off, what's going to happen? Yeah. You watch the old Batman shows and, you have these battles with the gangs and Batman, Robin are getting smacked across the face and punched all over the place. And I'm sitting there thinking, it shows you how old and jaded I am, is how the hell does Bruce Wayne explain that the next day? Bruce, your face looks like it's been through a meat grinder. Oh, it was a tough board meeting, let me tell you. He just had the crap beat out of him and, by a bunch of hired thugs. On TV, you get a crowbar across the head, you shake it off and you go on. In real life, you lay there unconscious, concussed, and possibly dead. So I can't look at these things like that anymore. After Crisis, I started writing less superheroes and more grounded characters like Vigilante and Checkmate. I was much happier doing that stuff than I was superheroes. I had written a lot of superheroes, and I'm glad I did. I love this stuff, and I got it out of my system. But, it was much easier to write these guys when you don't have to explain those heat beams coming out of his eyes, and where the stories can be more grounded and more based on emotion than the physical activity. I'm currently conducting interviews with creators for my next book and talking about creativity and things like that. And one guy, guy's been working for the last 10 years or so, said, I envy what you guys used to do. You could do these stories where people could sit around and have quiet moments. But now you do that, and the editor goes, no, get to the action. Let's, stop this. We don't want this character stuff. That's more my speed. That became more my speed, which is why, when I shifted over to writing prose a few years later, now I can get into it. I can write about my characters as opposed to just do these kind of relatively superficial stories. Not that the stories in comics are superficial. They are complete for what they are. But again, you can't get the depth of a story in comic book form that you can in prose. When I was an editor at DC, I worked in licensed publishing for a while. And one of the things I edited was a trilogy of Green Lantern novels, plotted by Christopher Priest, and then he wrote the third book. And I had to pursue him to the ends of the earth to get him to write the goddamn novel. He just kept pushing back and resisting. And finally it was like, all right, the deadline is here. So he finally sat down and did it. Now he curses me because that's what he wants to do now. He doesn't want to write comic books anymore. He wants to write novels because you can actually sit down and write, There's no continuity hanging over you. When he wrote the Green Lantern thing, he said, I didn't have to ask anybody for any, I just had to ask Paul. Is it okay for Superman to have a dog? Yes, it's fine. This is its own continuity. It doesn't matter what you do. Have fun. And he did.
And even though he's writing on a deadline, it's under a different type of deadline. It's a different set of circumstances. It's different people that are beholden to it. He doesn't have to get it to an artist to draw everything.
Right. Yeah, and also when you're writing a story or a novel, it's just you. If it's good, it's yours. If it's bad, it's yours. But there's nobody in between. There's an editor, but generally there's not as much control put on books as there are over comic book stories, especially these days. And you don't have to rely on an artist to interpret it and an inker to muddy it up and a letterer to put the words in the wrong order and a colorist to make it even muddier. I'm not saying that's what they all do, but there are worst case scenarios and they happen. So it's all yours. You do what you do and nobody else has any say over it. It's freaking amazing.
I've always lauded the collaborative element of comic book fiction, but it certainly has limitations in terms of if someone has a very clear vision unto themselves, then they have to make it work with people.
It's also largely not as collaborative as most people who don't do it think. In all my years of doing it, I was writing a script that I gave to an editor who gave it to an artist, and I got to see it when it was published. I wasn't talking to Norm Breyfogle. I wasn't talking to the Kennedy brothers on that stuff. Certainly never talked to Kurt Swan or Kurt Schaffenberger about a Superman or Superboy story. I wrote a script, and I gave it to Julie. And Julie attacked it with his lead pencil. And the next time I saw it was, if I happened to be in the office and I saw the art, great. If not, usually when it was published. I did a 6-issue miniseries that Jack Kirby drew, but I never worked with Jack Kirby.
There's a lot of viewpoints going into it, even if it's how someone interprets your script.
But because it's not a true collage. I mean, yes, there were instances. There was Archie Goodwin and Walter Simonson on Manhunter. There were guys who sat down and talked, writers and artists who talked, Len Wein and Bernie on Swamp Thing. These guys talked about the stories with the artist. But for the most part, it's a factory. Everybody's at their own station. I'm putting the engine in and this guy is slapping on the wheels and that guy's doing this. And we talk to each other at conventions, but not while the work is getting done.
Sure. And with comics, of course, it's such a grind to get everything out there.
Sure.
It's such a rush. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. So I had 2 last questions for you about the story. So one, when I was doing an image search for this, I could not for the life of me find any official art or really any art related to the character of Ultima, any sort of interpretation of the character.
None that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I was just curious if anyone had ever sent you anything or anything, just because while you can visualize the character from the description, like I said, I was working on a video for the character and I just didn't have anything to even reference.
As far as I know, no. I mean, the only outside mention of this that I've ever seen was a review of the book in some science fiction magazine, and they singled out my story, which was very nice. But then I later found out it was written by an old friend. So who knows? But
well, clearly, and unfortunately for me, there just hasn't been a lot of people trying to interpret it into a visual media.
Yeah.
The last question I have is, so when I was trying to track this down to give it to my co-host so he could read it, it was very difficult. I was able to find some physical copies of the Superheroes anthology available, but in terms of a digital version, the only one I found was a later collection that you had put out called In My Shorts.
Right.
And so I was curious, like, well, what has been the life of this since then?
You have just described it.
Yeah, just that.
Yeah, I put out In My Shorts in the teens. I don't know, I guess 16, 17, maybe before then, I don't remember. But yeah, that was it. Those 2 appearances. And which, by the way, copy is available at paulkupperberg.net.
Have you ever thought about doing anything else with it? Like, it's such a fun story that, like I said, it stood out to people who told me about it before I even found the book. It has always stood out to me. Any thoughts of anyone ever like approaching you discussing like adaptation of some form? Or
Once I got a call from a producer at Universal. I was working at DC at the time, and I got a call there at my office, and he said it was just the type of story he was looking for to adapt into a movie, and he thought it was a great idea, and yada, yada, yada. He gives you this whole Hollywood bullshit is being piled on me, and if there's one thing I know, it ain't real until the check's been deposited and cashed. So I went, yeah, great, whatever. He goes, all right, you'll either hear from me in the next week or 2, or you'll never hear from me again. Never heard from him again. However, I did see the Will Smith movie Hancock.
When that movie came out, it actually gave me vibes.
Gave me vibes too.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. I did call an IP attorney, and he said, yeah, probably stole the idea from you, but you'll never be able to prove it. So,
yeah,
save your time and money.
If it makes you feel any better, like, the movie is not particularly well loved. So.
It's not a particularly good movie. I see it and I just want to slap Will Smith. No, I kid. I kid about slapping Will Smith, about slapping anybody. I don't believe in violence. I just write about it.
In graphic detail in this short story.
My ex-wife, I wrote a short story called Food for the Beast, which was a horror story about a writer who cleaned up his life and doesn't feel he can write as well as he used to. And an old friend comes back and convinces him to turn to the dark side to regain his writing mojo. And he goes off on this tear and kills a shrink and his wife and all that. And my ex-wife read it, and she's like, now I'm afraid of you. I went, no, that's just in here. It's very dark and creaky in here, and your feet stick to the floor, but I don't act out on it. I get to write about it.
These are the dark places of my soul, but don't worry about it. They never escape.
Yeah, they don't come out. They except when I'm sleeping. Those are the screams you hear.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for coming on. I don't want to take up any more of your time, but I do really appreciate this. And I did just want to let you know, like, this was a story that really meant a lot to me when I first read it, and has always been a thing I've recommended to people over the years. And it's just really cool to talk to you.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you. It's nice to know it didn't just drop off into the void. So.
Well, we're going to cut back over to the main episode. But again, thank you, Paul. And you can find it at paulkupperberg.net, you said?
paulkupperberg.net. Yeah, just go to my shop. There's copies of In My Shorts available for purchase, signed and personalized.
Awesome. Everyone should go check that out. Remember, if you like the clip, after you're done liking and subscribing, check out certainpov.com, where you can find more episodes of the show, as well as a ton of other great shows.